Here I am back with another Colors of Prague episode. It's the YouTube channel, I guess it is now, where I discuss progressive rock music, prog rock. And this time I'm doing something a little different. Definitions, terms. Progressive rock, prog rock has some of the most hardcore, loyal fans, aficionados, followers, as in classical music, jazz music, blues music, country music, metal, goth, so on and so forth. Every descriptive genre of music, much like film, it's all subjective, what you like, what you don't like. But the hardcore blues people, they like within that acoustic blues, blues purists, there are blues purists, jazz, Mingus, it goes on from there, all the, bebop, acoustic jazz, then the jazz sections. So, getting back to Prague, there exist different types of the music. So, over the years, people started categorizing the different Prague styles. So now you see things, if you're unfamiliar or just getting into prog music, or if you really haven't been paying that much attention and you're wondering, what do they mean by RPI? What do they mean by Canterbury Sound, Canterbury Scene? What do they mean by Symphonic Prog? Is that yes? Is it all yes? No, actually, I tried to find out some things about this so you guys know. And the weird thing about it all is that, again, it's all subjective. A lot of this came to be in the 60s and the 70s, of course, where some of the best music was made. Not to say there's no great music being done since in the 80s, 90s, and today. And today, we used to say the 2000s, we're now the 2010s. So let's start with the Canterbury scene. Very interesting one. So as far as I can ascertain, bands that are now known for the Canterbury Sound were into pop, R&B. I mean, all their love of jazz, some love of country. It's pretty much that was the scene in Great Britain at the time and surrounding areas. That was the thing. But then they slowly started to experiment. You got the psychedelic period. So you're mixing in that. And then there's the great British love of folk music that goes back hundreds of years. Thousands of years. So all that became into a really heady mixture. And there are some bands that, yes, they have the Canterbury, like Caravan. Caravan has very good, heavy sound. It's almost elegiac in a way. It just kind of washes over you. I don't want to go into the personnel and such because I want this to be a bit of a shorter show. And another band with that sound also begins with the letter C is Camel. Now, this is a great set, by the way, for those unfamiliar with Caravan. It's on the Duran label from the UK. And it's a great 2-disc set. Almost every song is a gem except for later work. And the same thing can be said for Camel. Don't get me wrong, not both of these bands did not do incredibly stellar work all the time. But for the most part, in the early years, the Canterbury scene was at its height, and these guys were churning out some great, great recordings. And they did so later on. But every so often, someone wanted to go a little bit more pop. And the results were interesting. So, this Canterbury Sound, you had bands like Soft Machine, and then you had bands like Hatfield in the North and National Health. Those are bands I'm not personally fond of, the last two, but they do have their followers. There are artists who were involved in the Canterbury scene: Alan Holdsworth, Andy Summers, later of the Police, the guitar player, Steve Hillage, most famously with Gong and then solo. So it's almost indescribable if you say the Canterbury sound or the Canterbury style. I mean, reference to progressive rock music. Well, yes and no, because Soft Machine, which I just mentioned, and some other bands, Gong, also was started around that area. The cathedral city of Canterbury, actually, in England. And David Allen, who formed Gong. But then the sound moved away and became more experimental, more progressive, for lack of a better word. So the Canterbury Sound, it's a label that's been put on music, but it's almost indescribable because there's variants of that. So if you hear the Canterbury Sound, I tend to think of Camel, Caravan, and a few others, Hatfield in the North. Would I think of Gong? Would I think of Soft Machine? No, because I think those bands became much more experimental over a period of time. And I'll mention Gong again later. So we have crossover prog. What is crossover prog? Well, it's a interesting term, isn't it? Not. It's your progressive. Your progressive rock band that you could tell weren't, yes, a crossover prog band? Definitely. Especially with the members changing over a period of time, especially in the 80s, and delivering stellar pop hits. You know, I'm a big Yes fan, but yes, I may have to admit that they were losing part of an audience and losing popularity at some point in time with personnel changes. And in came a new guitarist and some additional people from the band Buggles, some other members. Again, I'm not going to go into naming all these names of personnel. That's for a different time. And Owner of a Lonely Heart. That's definitely crossover prog. Pop. But also, can crossover prog apply to jazz? Very well could, instrumentally. And Zuul, that whole sound there, very symphonic, and then classical, and then heavy. So, it's a term that's interesting, to say the least. But I say, if you're going to think crossover prog, I don't know, you could also think Jethro Tull, who had some very good, heavy albums. The earliest ones are the best, of course, and crossed over with hits, which was still very proggy, and over a period of time became even more popular in their sound, maybe for a while, and to some, past the point of no return, losing that progressive rock sound, becoming a synthesis of the folk that influenced Tull, the folk sounds, and something else. I have no idea. Krautrock is a very interesting definition. It's also called cosmic music. Primarily is referred to in German bands. You could say it was an avant-garde experimental rock movement. Emerged at the late 60s in Germany. More electronic sounds, the earliest versions of synthesizers, sometimes using true percussionists, unusual forms of percussion, unusual instruments, homegrown instruments, made up, synthesized vocals, vocals sung through other objects, other instruments. Very weird, out there. Was psychedelia an influence on us? I would have to say yes. Much like it was on much of the music of the late 60s and early 70s. But the cosmic music, Krautrock style is very much different. Now, the fun thing was that term was first used by the British music press in a derogatory way because they didn't know how to describe this music, which is true. But the term found a better reputation, and I'm quoting from the Prog Rock archives here, over a period of time when it became more respected. But the term stood. Another thing about this kind of music, it could be hallucinatory at times, and no, you're not going to see other things unless you're taking something. But if you open your mind and close your eyes, you could be taken to other places. I mean, music does that to people. But it could be primitive. Some very, very raw sounds of this kind of music can also be grating. So it depends on your appreciation for some of the more experimental variations of this, which are also Zuul, which I'll get into in a little later. You have Symphonic Prog. Sounds like it is, right? It's been said that many of the bands that are into the symphonic sound, so we'll pick, yes, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, were influenced by classical music. I can't deny I hear those sounds in there. A lot of it has to do with the keyboardist and what the keyboardist was listening to as an influence. And then the guitar players that have gone through these bands. I mean, but the first earliest, yes, guitar players, definitely much different sound and style from, let's say, Steve Howe, who joined a little later. He was not an original member, but yes, still retains a very interesting sound. I keep going back to yes, especially with the Symphonic Prog definition, because John Anderson has that high voice, almost like a choir boy. Church. A very English tradition. Classical music. There's a lot of bands out there now doing the symphonic sound. It's very dreamy, it's very special, it's very, again, like many of these things, it's an experience. You could call something else symphonic, could you not? Of course. Most interesting one up next is RPI, Rock Progressive Italiano. So if you've been on a chat room or you've been reading about some progressive rock music and you see the term or hear the term RPI, what are they talking about? It's Rock Progressive Italiano. So, according to Franco Musida from PFM, who evidently had written about this, progressive rock, or RPI, is basically a blending of three elements: the song, the improvisation inspired by jazz, and the composition in a classical style. The cocktail is interpreted in different ways in every country. In England, for instance, Celtic rock and blues influences prevail. In Italy, we have to cope with our classical tradition, melodrama, Puccini, and the contemporary classical composers. That's a pretty good quote, because it's actually deeper than that. It's RPI, Progressive Italian rock, is born of Italy's love of language. It's a beautiful romantic language. You will find not very few people to argue that point. And Christianity was a big thing in that country. And then politics, big heavy thing. There was a lot of heavy stuff going on in Italy post-World War II, and resurgence of that in the 50s, 60s, when there was extremist movements, the right and the left politically. It in a way led musicians, young musicians, to discover a synthesis of sounds influenced by all this stuff going on around them, and then their history. Very interesting. There's a lot of great RPI bands. PFM, Banco del Mutuo, Osana, Leormi. I mean, even today, some of those bands are still around, amazingly. And some of the new bands are quite good. Not every RPI band is terrific. And some of them have been around for so long. As I mentioned earlier about other kinds of music, I think it was the Camel and Caravan, you could be hitting it out for 40 years. You're bound to try something else. For example, PFM, they did some albums in English language. Leormi also did a English language version of one of their most famous albums. Very interesting. So that's your RPI thing there. Zuul, which I mentioned earlier, is again that heavy sound. Zuul isn't a real word. It was a language was invented allegedly by Christian Vander, drummer and founder of Magma, the French heavy industrial psychedelic space rock band. And so Christian Vander came up with this language called Kobayan, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Zuul is a word he used to describe his music, which he said is celestial music. There's a lot of different stuff going on in Zuul music. It's heavier. It's definitely more percussive. It's also more dark. A lot of heavy bass going on there. Sometimes the vocals could be deep. And I personally believe a lot of Zuul music kind of led to, years later, some of the more aggressive metal bands. Because if you listen to some of this material from 68, 69, 70, 71, and 72, the formative years of Zuul, you could hear things in Hawkwind. You could hear things in aggressive punk years later. And then some much later, some of the German bands that kind of re-embraced this sound. Dark metal owes a huge debt to this thing. So interesting how all things come around. And we have heavy prog. I've seen things described as heavy prog. What does that mean? I don't know. I've been looking around for your entertainment, and so bands as diverse as Zeppelin, Sabbath, Cream, Zeuhl, because they had a more guitar-oriented sound based in the rhythm and blues, but with the progressive rock elements, were called heavy prog, or are now referred to as heavy prog. I don't know. I would take that to task. Some bands also, later bands like Rush, Porcupine Tree, Mars Volta, Uriah Heep, which I always thought of as hard rock, are labeled such. And so that's one open for your own interpretation. You could space out to some really great instrumental that goes on for 16 minutes. Like, that's heavy, man. Open to all this is open to your own interpretation. So anyway, if you ever heard these terms before, wondered what they meant, that was like the Cliff Notes version. So here's a couple of things I mentioned. So Gong, Radio Gnome Invisible Part 1, also known as the Flying Teapot album. One of their most well-known and best-loved albums, but accessible to people who like or enjoy sing-along poppier versions of progressive. Maybe not. More in that Krautrock, and again, not so much, I would say, it would be Asherah Temple, who along with Amandul have a huge following. And that's another band that over the years had members come and go, except for Manuel Gottstring, who was an original co-creator of the band and is still around, I believe. So we have, or is Les Armées. Those unfamiliar with Les Armées, this is quite nice. There's a lot of Le Infinito. It's from 2004. So I mentioned earlier, they've been around for a very long time. Banco del Mutuo Soccorso. Darwin is one of the most beloved recordings. Some of these are incredibly hard to find, so you might be only able to locate a compact disc of a very popular Italian album from 1970. If you look hard enough, I did have a show where to find these things. You might find something. IO Earth is a band I quite like. This is one of their latest releases, Solitude. Well, it's maybe not that latest, but I quite like them. You could say their sound is almost symphonic, hallucinatory, very dreamy, ethereal, great guitar playing. The band is always great. I don't believe they have a singer, though, that has stayed for more than 2 albums, although I believe that Rosanna, who is on their latest, and I've seen many times live, will probably be appearing on their other ones, so they're going to finally break that thing. So prog folk, what's that? Straubs? More than just folk, very unusual progressive sound. Fairport Convention. Has anyone really listened to those first 4 albums and heard them play live on the BBC recordings? Well, not in person, but the live BBC recordings. Definitely out there. Definitely. You could hear the influence dragging them from all over the place. Beside English historical music, You could hear the pull of the band. You could hear the pull of Pink Floyd. You could hear the pull musically of so many great areas. So Prog folk, yeah, I would call them that. One thing I haven't mentioned is, because there are so many countries in the world, there's Greece, there's Norway, Mexico, France, Spain. I've gotten progressive rock music from all these countries, and I'll be discussing it later on in other programs. Is Japan. You do not hear too much about Japanese prog. They've been around for a long time. Bands have been around for a long time, making some really, really good music. I have been gathering up a collection of Japanese progressive rock bands and information on such. And so, but one of my current favorites, and they have been since I first saw them, 2016, 2017, is Astorius. And they have a electric Astorius, just Astorius, and acoustic Astorius. And there's also offshoots of this band, which very, very good Japanese band, Japanese progressive rock band. So we didn't really review 4 or 5 releases like I usually do, but I thought it was interesting to mention terms. So if you're reading about it, hearing about it, somebody tells you about it, or you're on Facebook and say, this isn't the Canterbury Sound. What the hell does that mean? So maybe you have an idea. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're still confused. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this one. Have a great day.